Have you ever had one of those moments where you're sitting completely still and the world is quiet around you, but something inside your chest feels louder than anything else? Sss. Like a low hum you can't quite turn off. You scroll your phone, you open another video, you start a new game, and for a little while, it goes away. But then the screen goes dark, and there it is again, that quiet, uncomfortable question sitting in the back of your mind. What am I actually doing with my life? Most people feel this at some point. But there's a version of this feeling that doesn't go away after your teenage years. There's a version of it that follows a man into his 20s, his 30s, his 40s, and beyond. He pays his rent, maybe. He shows up to work, sometimes. But inside, underneath the surface of his adult-looking life, something never quite crossed the threshold into maturity. He is, in the truest psychological sense of the word, still waiting to grow up. And that's not a judgment. That's a diagnosis. One worth understanding deeply, because the men who recognize this pattern in themselves are the ones who actually have a shot at changing it. Today, we're going to go deep into the psychology of what some researchers call the eternal boy, the man-child, the man who lives life like it's a long rehearsal for something that never actually begins. We're going to talk about where this comes from, how it hides itself, and, most importantly, what it actually takes to walk out of it. This is not going to be easy to hear in places. But if you can sit with a little discomfort for the next 20 minutes, you might walk away from this video a fundamentally different person than you were when you pressed play. Let's start at the beginning. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung used a Latin phrase, puers aeternus, which translates directly to the eternal boy. His colleague Marie-Louise von Franz expanded on this concept extensively, and what she found was fascinating, unsettling, and deeply human all at once. The eternal boy isn't stupid. He isn't lazy in the traditional sense. In fact, he is often extraordinarily gifted. He has ideas that light up rooms. He can see connections other people miss. He is, by almost every early measure, someone with tremendous potential. And that, ironically, is exactly where the problem begins. Think back to what it felt like to be the smart kid. Maybe you were the one in class who figured things out before the teacher finished the sentence. Maybe your parents lit up when they talked about you. Teachers told you that you were going places. There was a label, spoken or unspoken, that followed you around like a shadow. This one is special, and it felt good. Of course it did. That recognition became part of how you understood yourself. But here's where the trap springs shut. Potential is praised in childhood. Results are demanded in adulthood, when you step into the real world. When you take your first job, launch your first project, pursue your first real goal, you are not great at it. You can't be. No one is great at the beginning. The requires you to be clumsy, to be corrected, to be passed over by people with less raw talent but more accumulated experience. And for the man who built his entire sense of identity around being exceptional, that experience doesn't just feel disappointing. It feels existentially threatening. So the mind does what minds are designed to do. It protects you. It finds a way to keep the threat away from the core of who you believe yourself to be. And the most elegant protection it finds is this. Don't fully start, because if you never truly begin, you never have to confront what happens when you do. This is the real engine underneath procrastination for the eternal boy. It is not laziness. It is not bad time management. It is a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism, one that keeps the dream alive by keeping it untested. As long as you haven't written the book, you can still believe you would write a great one. As long as you haven't started the business remains perfect in your mind. The moment you step into reality, reality talks back. And reality is not always kind. Jung described this way of living with a phrase that I think is one of the most accurate descriptions I've ever encountered for this particular kind of stagnation. He called it the provisional life. The feeling that whatever you're doing right now is not your real life, that this apartment is temporary, that this job is just a placeholder, that this relationship is fine for now, but not the real thing, that your real life, your actual, meaningful, fully expressed life, is waiting somewhere just ahead, and you'll get there when the time is right. The tragedy is that the time never becomes right on its own. You have to make it right. And then, the man living the provisional life keeps pushing that moment further and further into the future, while calling it patience, while calling it discernment, while calling it waiting for the perfect opportunity. Meanwhile, the people around him are living. Not perfectly, not without fear, but actually living, stepping into things, failing at some of them, recovering, adjusting, building something real out of the raw material of actual experience. And from his spot on the sidelines, the eternal boy watches them with a complicated feeling he may not even be fully conscious of. Part admiration, part contempt, part envy he can't quite name. He tells himself they're trapped. He tells himself the 9 to 5 is a cage and he's still free. But freedom that produces nothing, that builds nothing, that connects to nothing, that's not freedom. That's avoidance wearing freedom's clothes. Now let's talk about how this plays out in day-to-day life, because it doesn't always look like a guy lying on a couch doing nothing. Sometimes it's more subtle than that. The first pattern is what I call the numbing cycle. Life creates pressure. Pressure creates discomfort. Discomfort needs to go somewhere. For the mature adult, discomfort is processed, felt, analyzed, responded to. For the eternal boy, discomfort is escaped. He reaches for his phone. He opens a game. He goes down a rabbit hole online that has nothing to do with anything he actually needs. He stays up until 3 in the morning, watching videos he'll barely remember, because sleep means waking up. And waking up means facing the day, and the day has things in it that require him to be someone he's not sure he can be. Here's the crucial distinction. Entertainment isn't the problem. Rest isn't the problem. The problem is the function these things are serving. When a man uses a video game to relax after a genuinely productive day, that's healthy. When a man uses a video game to avoid the discomfort of being productive at all, he's not playing, he's hiding. And the hiding feels exactly like relief, which is what makes it so insidious. It solves nothing, but it feels like it does. And it does so just well enough to keep the cycle going. The second pattern is the allergic reaction to commitment. In the early stages of anything, a relationship, a project, a career path, the eternal boy is often incredibly enthusiastic. He can be charming and energetic and full of vision. But as the thing progresses, as it starts to ask something of him beyond excitement, something shifts. The relationship starts asking about the future. The job starts requiring consistency. The project reveals how much actual work it needs. And suddenly, he starts to notice flaws he didn't see before. The relationship isn't perfect. The job has politics. The project has obstacles. And he begins to pull back. Slowly, quietly, always with a reason that sounds reasonable. In relationships, specifically, this can manifest in a particularly painful way. He often ends up with someone who compensates for what he doesn't carry, someone who manages the logistics, makes the decisions, holds the emotional weight of the relationship. Over time, without either of them quite realizing it, the dynamic becomes less like a partnership and more like a parent and a child. And when that relationship ends, which it often does, eventually, he carries very little clarity about his own role in how it got there. The third pattern is the victim posture. When the eternal boy looks at the pressures of adult life, the expectations, the responsibilities, the costs, the timelines, he doesn't see challenges to be navigated. He sees enemies. His boss becomes an obstacle. Society's demands become oppression. The ticking clock of his own life becomes something cruel and unfair. This is the Peter Pan dynamic in its most modern form. Captain Hook isn't a villain, he's just adulthood. And adulthood always feels like a threat when you've never made peace with it. What makes this so dangerous is that the victim posture is never entirely wrong. The economy is genuinely difficult. The job market is genuinely unfair in places. Systemic inequality is real. There are legitimate reasons to feel frustrated. But the eternal boy takes those legitimate frustrations and uses them as a comprehensive explanation for his lack of movement. They become the reason he doesn't try. And the moment your circumstances become the full explanation for your inaction, you have handed over all your power to those circumstances. You are no longer a person navigating a difficult world. You are a person waiting for the world to stop being difficult before you begin. So where does all of this come from? We talked about the gifted child, the praise, the identity built around potential. But there's often something deeper running underneath that. Von Franz observed that many men in the eternal boy state had childhoods shaped by one of two extremes. Either a parent who was overprotective and never let them fail, so they arrived at adulthood having never actually processed failure, never built the internal tolerance for it, or a parent who was emotionally absent. Leaving behind a wound, the child learned to manage by retreating into fantasy, into imagination, into an inner world where he was in control and things were safe. Both pathways lead to the same destination. A man who never quite learned how to be fully present to difficult reality, how to stay in the room when things get uncomfortable, how to pick himself up after falling without someone else catching him first. And Jung left us with a quote that I think is worth sitting with slowly. He said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." What he meant was that when parents don't live their own lives fully, when they carry their own unresolved dreams, their own suppressed potential, their own unlived choices, that weight passes down. Children absorb it. And sometimes, what looks like a son's laziness is actually a son carrying his father's unspoken regret without either of them knowing it. That's not an excuse, but it is a context. And context matters because the way you exit this pattern has to address the root, not just the symptoms. So what does actually changing look like? The first thing that has to shift is how you think about growing up itself. The eternal boy resists maturity because he has unconsciously framed it as a kind of death. The death of possibility, of freedom, of the person he could have been. He sees responsibility as a cage, commitment as limitation, structure as the enemy of creativity. But this is exactly backwards. Responsibility doesn't cage your potential. It gives your potential somewhere to land. A man with a brilliant creative mind and zero discipline is a man whose creativity evaporates into the air. A man with the same creative mind who also shows up consistently, who handles his finances, who follows through on what he says. That man can actually build something with what he has. The structure doesn't kill the dream. The structure is what makes the dream survivable in the real world. Think about any artist, any creator, any person who has actually produced something of lasting value. They did not wait in for inspiration. They did not wait until they felt ready. They sat down and did the work, day after day, in rooms no one saw, through stretches of doubt and frustration, and the very real possibility that it might not come together. Their freedom came not from avoiding commitment, but from having built enough reliability in themselves that they could be trusted with the things they cared about most. The second shift is learning to take ordinary things seriously. This one sounds too simple, but I want you to hear it carefully. The eternal boy tends to see the small tasks of adult life: cleaning, budgeting, showing up reliably, responding to people on time, as beneath him. Not overtly, maybe, not consciously, but there's a way he holds those things at arm's length, as if engaging with them fully would somehow confirm that this ordinary life is all there is. What actually happens when you start taking those small things seriously is the opposite of what he fears. When you clean your space with full attention, not with a podcast in your ears, not half thinking about something else, you are practicing the act of being present to reality. When you handle your finances carefully, when you show up on time, when you do the unglamorous parts of your work with real effort, you are building a relationship with reality that makes everything else more possible. You are pulling yourself down from the clouds, not because the clouds are bad, but because you cannot build anything up there. The third shift is the one that requires the most courage. Deliberate exposure to failure. The core wound underneath all of this is the terror that you are not, in fact, as exceptional as you were told. That if you truly try and truly fail, something will be confirmed that you have spent years making sure was never confirmed. That your potential was just a story. That you were ordinary all along. The only way to dissolve that terror is to walk directly into it. Choose something you have been avoiding because you're afraid you won't be good enough at it. Apply for the job. Submit the work. Have the difficult conversation. Sign up for the class where you will be a beginner. And when you fail, not if, when, notice what actually happens. Notice that the world does not end. Notice that you are still here. Notice that failure, survived and learned from, is exactly how every person who has ever achieved anything got to where they were. The mythology of Icarus is instructive here. He had wings, real wings, capable of carrying him to freedom. But he flew so high, so hungry, to skip the careful middle part that the sun melted what held him up. The wings were never the problem. The refusal to respect the ground was the problem. Potential is real. Your potential may be entirely real, but potential without the steady, unglamorous work of building, skill by skill, day by day, ends the same way every time. The fourth shift is finding an external structure that holds you accountable. This one is hard to hear for the man who prides himself on independence. But here's the truth. Willpower alone is not enough in the beginning, especially when you've spent years negotiating with yourself to avoid discomfort. Your own mind is too fluent in your own excuses. It knows every argument before you make it. It can produce a reason to rest for another day that sounds entirely reasonable. And part of you will believe it. What breaks that pattern is placing yourself inside a structure that doesn't negotiate. A mentor who is honest rather than supportive in the comfortable sense. A community of people who hold themselves to high standards and expect the same of you. And an environment where your follow-through or lack of it is visible, where there are real consequences for disappearing into yourself again. This isn't weakness, this is intelligence. Every elite performer in any field, every professional athlete, every serious artist, every high-performing leader has people around them who hold them to account. The lone wolf who needs no one is a fantasy, and It is a fantasy the eternal boy finds particularly appealing because the lone wolf doesn't have to answer to anyone. There will come a day. And for some of you listening, that day might be today, when you look back across the years and you feel the full weight of the time that passed while you were waiting for your life to begin. That day does not have to be at the end. You can feel that weight now, while there's still time to do something about it. You can use it not as a reason to spiral into shame, but as information, as a compass pointing toward what needs to change. Because here's what's true. The man inside you, who has been waiting, who has been hiding inside the provisional life, inside the numbness, inside the comfortable illusion that his best days are ahead without any effort. That man is not who you are. He is a protective layer that formed a long time ago around a wound that deserved to be protected. But you are not a wound anymore. You are a man with years in front of you, with capacity that has never been fully used, with the ability to choose differently, starting with the very next decision you make. Carl Jung also wrote this. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What we've talked about today is the process of making the unconscious conscious, seeing the pattern, naming the mechanism, understanding the fear underneath the avoidance. That understanding alone does not change anything, but it makes change possible in a way it wasn't before. The difference between the man who stays stuck and the man who doesn't is not intelligence. It is not luck. It is not even talent. It is whether he was willing, at some specific moment, to stop managing the discomfort of not living fully and instead walk directly into the harder, realer, infinitely more meaningful experience of actually beginning. You have been in the stands long enough. The field has been waiting.